In most games, bosses are some of the most memorable encounters in a playthrough. In Dragon Quest III, a highlight for me was finally beating the Orochi after 3 attempts. In Risk of Rain 2, it's pretty exciting when you fight Mithrix for the first time, and in the Pokemon games, the most memorable encounters are usually the Gym Leader's Elite Four and rival battles, especially tough ones like Cynthia in Gen 4. Fire Emblem has more boss fights than most games, including a boss fight on almost every single map, and sometimes more than one boss per map. And yet, they tend to be a less memorable part of Fire Emblem games compared to other games. I'm going to talk about why I think it's hard to do a really good Fire Emblem boss, why I think it's actually okay for bosses to be a little lackluster in some cases, how Fire Emblem has done bosses well, and how I would like to see them iterate on bosses in the future. Let's start with why it's historically been pretty difficult to do a good Fire Emblem boss compared to other games, and especially other RPGs. Fire Emblem is a strategy RPG with random growths, permadeath, and a leveling and stat system that allows players or enemies to have extremely disparate stats. Additionally, it's a game where combat is fundamentally simple. You can tell pretty accurately how a fight is going to go at a glance before having to commit to any action. So outside of variance that comes from hit rates and crit rates, 1v1 fights in Fire Emblem are fairly predictable, especially for strong units who can easily have incredibly lopsided combat previews compared to most enemies. Interesting gameplay in Fire Emblem doesn't usually come from individual fights, but rather from dealing with formations of enemies or dealing with enemies while attempting to achieve some objective like getting to a recruitable unit before they're killed by the enemy. This ties into the first issue I have with a lot of Fire Emblem bosses. A lot of them are stationary enemies that can be dealt with safely and individually after handling all of the interesting challenges on a map. At that point, we're left with a single notable enemy, which doesn't make for the most interesting challenge, especially since single enemies are often pretty abusable. Because of the simple combat and stats that aren't malleable in the middle of the map, it's hard to strike a good balance with a single enemy boss where they are challenging but not overwhelming and frustrating, and not too weak to put up a major fight. A good example of a boss that does not strike this balance is Gazak in Chapter 1 of Shadow Dragon. This boss doesn't take much damage from your allies, deals a lot in return, and sometimes doubles them. This is undoubtedly a challenging boss, but unfortunately he's so challenging that the most obvious approach for dealing with him is to stay out of his range and chuck javelins at him for 8 million turns, until he dies. This is simple to figure out because FE math is pretty transparent and easy. We can see that our units are going to get bodied by the boss, so we know our best chance is to chuck javelins at him. It's effective, but it's boring. On the flip side, a lot of bosses in Fire Emblem are easy enough that beating them is pretty trivial. FE1 and FE3 Book 1, which FE11 is a remake of, have their own version of that same Chapter 1 boss, but he's pretty much a weenie in those games that you can broadly approach and fight with any of your units the same way you could any other enemy. In those games, Gazak is just a slightly bulkier, slightly stronger version of the generic pirates on the same map. Part of the challenge here is that a lot of Fire Emblem bosses are stationary. So even in the example of our super hard boss in Shadow Dragon, he's hard to kill, but he doesn't actually add that much challenge to the map because we can exploit that he doesn't move. This is true of a lot of bosses, even those with 1-2 range. Take Chapter 14 of Erika Route in Sacred Stones. Its boss, Carlyle, is tricky in that he has high avoid on his throne and is very fast. So it's hard to double him, and sometimes you might even get doubled. However, he doesn't move. So as long as you don't attack him with a unit that gets one-rounded, there's no real risk of death here. Carlyle is only difficult to kill in the sense that most of your units won't be particularly good at killing him, but the actual chance of him killing one of your units or delivering you a game over is pretty low. What makes Carlyle difficult is essentially just that it's unreliable to hit him. But unreliability in the form of mischance can be overcome by simply taking more turns. If we have infinite time, unreliability where unit death isn't a possible outcome is a non-issue. Unreliability in the form of crit is a little different because getting crit can mean the death of one of your units, but most people won't find a boss too compelling if what makes them challenging is that they have a 20% chance of nuking your unit and an 80% chance of being a non-threat. Though one thing I will say in defense of bosses with crit chance is it does disincentivize you from doing the thing where we chuck javelins at a boss for 40 turns, because the more rounds of combat we do with the boss, the more likely he is to finally land that crit. So crit chances can encourage players to try to kill the boss in not too many rounds of combat, at least assuming they don't have a unit that can survive the crit. So basically, stationary bosses are really common and can be easy to exploit. and it's hard to make a single enemy an interesting fight. Next up, we'll get into how I think Fire Emblem has done bosses well before, but before we do, I want to spend a little time talking about why I think it's okay for bosses to be a little lackluster some of the time. Most Fire Emblem bosses just aren't analogous to bosses in other RPGs. In most of those games, bosses are built up to, at least to an extent, and are the climax of the part of the game where you fight them. In Dragon Quest IV, when you fight Balzac, I know, funny name, it's a big deal. We've built up to this, and it's a major part of the story. Even lesser bosses like the eyeball at the end of the first dungeon represent the most challenging part of a dungeon and the climax of a mini-arc. Most Fire Emblem bosses aren't like that. In FE3 Book 1, Kazak isn't meant to be an important character. When we start the map, he has 0 lines of dialogue. This isn't supposed to be a particularly important enemy that represents the climax of the map or an important part of the story. He's just supposed to sit on the throne and stop you from seizing it without resistance. That he has a portrait and a small amount of dialogue when you fight him is basically just for flavor. In Fire Emblem 1, he doesn't even have a portrait. Most of the time, maps in Fire Emblem are not about their bosses. They're just there to stop you from instantly grabbing the objective, or on things like defense maps, they can be there to be a side objective. Like Ubins in the chapter Kinship's Bond of FE7. His main role is just to be an enemy that's hard to get with a droppable item that you might want. The interesting part of the map is holding off the generics from getting to nils and getting to Ubins in the time limit. We can compare this to bosses in other RPGs. In Pokemon, gyms are largely about 2 things, the puzzle and the boss. Typically, all of the trainers of a gym, and often even NPCs in the surrounding town, will tell you all about the gym leader of the gym. And as you move through the gym, there's a promise of a tougher encounter and a build-up to it. When you play the 5th gym in Pokemon Sapphire, it's largely about and defined by Norman, the gym's leader and your father. The gym is ultimately about the boss. In Dragon Quest III, the dungeon where you fight the Orochi could be reasonably described as the Orochi dungeon. The Orochi is why you're there and defines the location. The first chapter of Fire Emblem 1, on the other hand, is decidedly not about Gazak. He's just another pirate. His job is just to stop you from seizing early, and the map is instead defined by the layout of its generic enemies and how it tutorializes mechanics like flight, villages, and in FE3, dismounting. The defensive tile Gazak sits on contributes to this goal. It makes him bulkier and harder to kill. This doesn't make Gazak really difficult to kill in FE3 or FE1, but it does make killing him take longer, meaning you're more likely to have to spend an extra turn fighting the pirates around him rather than just killing Gazak, seizing, and ignoring his pirate homies. In this sense, Gazak does his job. It's okay that Fire Emblem bosses aren't always the most exciting, because a lot of the time, Fire Emblem isn't really a game about fighting bosses. However, I do think Fire Emblem has done some pretty cool bosses, and that bosses in general could stand to improve a little. Generic bosses that aren't that important is fine sometimes, but we have them a lot in Fire Emblem's history. And it's also worth noting that while random nothing bosses like Gazak don't fill the same role as bosses in other RPGs, Fire Emblem does have plenty of bosses that do fill that role. I remember the first time I played Fire Emblem 7, and fighting Darren felt like a big moment. He was built up to, and he was blocking us from discovering what happened with Eliwood's father. He left his son to die in a previous chapter. He's comparable to Dragon Quest Orochi or Pokemon's Norman in his role. A major enemy built up to that should be exciting to fight. There are tons of bosses like this, and the execution of them definitely varies through the Fire Emblem series. So let's look at some Fire Emblem bosses I really like and see why they work. I also polled Twitter for bosses they liked, so I'll be including some of those as well. But before we get into bosses I like, a big thank you to some other people I like. My geckos and skinks on Patreon. Special shout out to my skinks, Morgwolf, Wingman, Upscale Furry Trash, Lonely Voxel, Cosplay Sylveon, Aikipoo, Lucy Sev, Emma, Stars to Art, The Noodle Doodler, Muted Miami, Aaron Geddon, Doopy, Autumn Leaf, and Red Mage Morgan. If you want to support the channel and get shoutouts in videos like this, and get early access to videos, you'll find the link to the Patreon in the video description. Starting with a stationary boss I really like from a game I played recently, we have Camus in FE3 Book 1's Chapter 16. This particular run was one where I was trying to maximize reliability and minimize turn count. In that context, Camus is sort of Book 1's final exam, because if you planned carefully, every map for the rest of the game is skippable. And what a final exam he is! Great stats and a powerful weapon that makes it difficult for your units to take more than one hit. Some of them can't even do that. He's also surrounded by powerful paladins, siege weapons, and just getting to him is an ordeal because the generics on the way are the strongest we've faced yet. A minor plus is that the paladins and ballistas surrounding him make the map pretty hard to warp skip, even if you did decide to issue the village to the south, though you won't want to since it gets you the Hammer and Mercurius and Est. It's pretty tough getting around it. You need to fight Camus and his knights in this map. I think this boss is pretty good on its own, but in a context where I cared about time, it became even cooler. Marth is busy for the first several turns grabbing a village while everyone else has to rush to the throne, so defeating Camus by the time Marth arrives is a real challenge. There's not enough time to take out all the paladins around him first, and not enough time to heal up all your units as they fight. Additionally, Camus is fast and dodgy. Earlier I said that dodginess adds unreliability but not difficulty, and that's true in a general sense, but not once you add a time constraint. When you have a time constraint, unreliability becomes a problem. We need to do our best to maximize our chance at killing the boss in a timely manner. As long as we have tools to increase our reliability, the fight becomes like a puzzle, figuring out how we can get the most allies in range to contribute, and how we can squeeze the most reliability out of them. Whether that be by using powerful weapons and supports, or just getting as many dudes as possible in to hit the boss. In this instance, the time constraint was self-imposed. Most people won't be trying to finish the map ASAP, but I think it at least shows how stationary bosses can be more interesting in certain playstyles, and how maps could add some form of pressure to add tension to a boss. A good example of this is in Book 2 of FE3, where Astrum's kill squads encourage you to get moving and go kill the boss. They provide some incentive not to just safely plink away at the boss for however many turns it takes. Gaiden requirements where you have to finish a map in a certain number of turns can do this too, without being overly punishing. Another cool thing about the Camus fight that makes it stand out is that it has some custom eventing that we don't see elsewhere in Book 1. When Marth approaches Camus, he and Nina plea with him not to fight them, but Camus lamentably won't relent. It's dramatic and evocative, and hypes up an already highly built up moment in the story. While this doesn't impact the gameplay at all, the way a boss fight is presented and dramatized is important for making it memorable. The Black Knight is a boss fight that I hate mechanically, but it's one that many people, including me, remember really strongly from their first playthrough because narratively it's awesome. I feel similarly about bosses like Shiharam in Path of Radiance. He's really not much more interesting to fight than any other boss, but the drama of the battle and the dialogue when you have Jill fight him is incredible and elevates the fight. Camus is my favorite boss in FE3 Book 1 because he combines being the most powerful enemy you've fought so far with a unique presentation that the game hasn't used up to this point. It makes the fight feel special and dramatic. The only couple things I would change about it are that I would make his paladin guards more aggressive once you attack Camus, making the area around him just that much more dangerous. And I would also make him move when you get close enough, maybe when Marth triggers the dialogue, though this would require you to change the objective to kill boss. Alternatively, something I would be interested to see Fire Emblem games try would be to include a map objective that requires you to kill the boss and then seize. To me, this would solve a lot of the perceived issues with stationary bosses without making throne seizing too trivial. More maps could experiment with putting a generic on a throne and a boss on the map somewhere too. FE3 Book 1 does this in Michaelis' map where he leaves the throne to come after you, and a generic guards the throne instead. This has a pretty cool effect. It makes Michaelis feel much more aggressive, even angry, compared to other bosses that sit and wait for you. There are just two trade-offs. One is that if you play the map normally, it can feel a little anticlimactic after you take Michaelis out on turn 4 or so, and have another 4 or 5 maps to play with the most climactic part of the chapter being done already. 2, him leaving the throne makes warping the map really easy, because the generic guarding the throne is pretty easy to kill. Although you could solve that by just using a stronger generic, or again, making the map kill boss and seize throne. In general, I think I could do with fewer completely stationary bosses, but I think they can be done well at times. A type of boss that was brought up a few times on Twitter was bosses like Selena in FE8. Bosses with siege tomes or some effect that makes their presence felt for most of a map, even if you aren't in range of fighting them yet. And I agree, I kinda like siege tome bosses. Obviously, it's possible to kill Selena early in FE8, but when I played the map for the first time, and I think for many people's first attempts at the map, I felt like I was dealing with Selena for a lot of the chapter. Her long range means that she's active on a lot of turns, and on turns where she can meaningfully impact the outcome of a map. This is different than stationary bosses that are often basically active for just 1 or 2 turns, or if they're tougher to kill, can be active for however many turns it takes you to kill them, but are unlikely to meaningfully impact the outcome of the map, since being stationary means you can fight them safely pretty often. This isn't to say every boss needs a siege tome, but I think the occasional siege tome boss is fun. Or you can use other methods of making a boss impact a map from far away, such as leadership stars in Thracia. A map that did this in a way I thought was clever was Chapter 20 of Engage, where Gris warps in and out to pester you as you progress through the map. Of course, you can just find him in the corner on turn 1 and whack him so that he doesn't do this, but I like the concept, and the first time I played the map not knowing I could whack him on turn 1, I thought it was very neat. Speaking of Engage, I think that entire game does bosses pretty well. Most bosses move, and also have multiple health bars, meaning you're going to have to kill them up to 4 times before they actually die. I really enjoyed this approach to bosses for a few reasons. First, it encourages you to use at least a few good combat units rather than just one. Enemies were scary enough in Engage that I usually didn't want to leave my allies in range of a bunch of enemies on enemy phase, especially if one was a boss, unless I was using some defensive tool like an Obstruct Staff or Bonded Shield or Core and Fire to prevent enemies from attacking all of my units, but coming up with how to use your defensive tools can be fun and strategic in its own way. Either way, the multiple health bars demand you make good use of your offensive and defensive tools, and especially in the early game where you're lacking some of the more broken abilities like Byleth's 4-way dance or even Seedal's regular dance, you're incentivized to use multiple units to fight the boss if you want to take them out in one turn. Chapter 5 feels like the first major test when it comes to Engage's bosses. There's several enemies around him that attack alongside him, and he's powerful enough to one-round some of your units. Add in his extra health bar, and it takes some planning to kill him on one turn, or to make sure all of your units live on enemy phase. On my first play of the map, I thought he was engaging, strategic, and a great introduction to the more complicated boss setups that come later in the game. And even now, I think he's still a pretty fun boss to fight on replays. Engage also provides its bosses with special abilities through emblem rings that further set them apart from regular enemies, and ask players to play maps a little differently. In Chapter 17, Zephyia uses Sigurd's massive movement range and override to charge forward into your army and heavily damage any large line of units you have, maybe even killing someone if they're on a horse since she has a Rider's Bane. This is both a cool moment and makes you think about your approach to the fight differently. Maybe you stagger your units so there's no good override available to her, or you can do my favorite thing, which is to make a small line of tanky units, and at the end of that line, put a box of units. This way, when Zephyia charges through the line, she can't canto away and is surrounded by your units that will beat her up next turn. These strategies aren't difficult to come up with, but I like that Zephyia, by behaving differently than normal enemies, encourages you to think a little differently about how you're going to approach fighting her. And this is true of a lot of enemies. An enemy with a strong engage attack is one you might want to be careful with on enemy phase. Playing around holdout can impact how you order your attacks against Marnie. Outside of the monsters in 3 houses and how Fates uses skills to make some bosses stand out, bosses mechanically feel the most unique they've ever felt to me in Engage. The other choice Engage makes with its bosses that I really like is how often it uses multiple of them. A lot of maps don't just have one boss, but 2 or even up to 6. I love maps with multiple bosses. They make it a little more difficult to dogpile on a single enemy with staves and debuffs to neutralize them, and multiple bosses can also fulfill different roles. So if you, say, wanted a boss to guard a throne, you could totally have a second one that moves around the map exerting pressure on the player. And depending on how you design the map, they can encourage the player to split up their army for a bigger challenge, which is great because it means you can't have all of your resources for either boss. If you have 2 bosses with 3 health bars on opposite sides of the map, and there's some incentive not to play too slow, such as strong reinforcements, then you have to decide how you're going to divide your tools between the bosses. Byleth only gets to dance at one boss, same with Seedal. Admittedly, most Engage maps don't really demand you do this, but I like it as an option that multiple bosses can enable. And of course, you could also do this with generic enemies, but I think doing it with bosses can be dramatic and fun. The random paladin that attacks you on the pirate map in FE7 would be a lot less exciting if he was just a generic instead of having a portrait and inexplicably hard dialogue for a generic boss. Also, giving difficult enemies portraits and names is a useful shorthand to tell players, hey, this enemy's pretty tough, pay attention to them. Of course, bosses aren't perfect in Engage. Eventually, your tools become so strong that a pretty reliable approach to bosses is to just have a couple good units and ship them off with a Dancer and Byleth to go kill the boss. And moving bosses on kill boss maps leads to a lot of maps that can be pretty trivially 1 or 2 turned without engaging with that much of the map. But for me, the bosses felt really good on my first playthrough, and I think it's a strong blueprint to be iterated on for future entries. And you may have noticed I've been focusing a bit on my first playthrough in this video, and that's because I've come to the conclusion that the first playthrough is the most important one to me. Obviously, it's preferable if things aren't super exploitable on repeat playthroughs, but ultimately that's just the nature of getting good at a video game. The more you play it and the more times you repeat it, it's generally going to become less challenging, and things that didn't seem exploitable on your first playthrough or two might seem exploitable on playthrough 20, and I don't think that's the end of the world. Moving away from mechanically strong bosses, I want to go into a little bit more detail on how narrative can make a boss memorable. I went into this a little bit with Camus, but I think a lot of bosses are memorable for reasons that have little to do with how interesting they are, but rather due to a strong presentation or strong place in the narrative. A boss that came up multiple times in my Twitter thread about good bosses, and one that I mentioned earlier in this video, was the Black Knight. That was interesting to me because I think that boss is mechanically awful. It's a fight where 2 dudes slap each other until one of them dies, and depending on how your Ike leveled, winning it can be contingent on whether you or the Black Knight proc your skills more. As far as strategy goes, there's not a lot of meat on the bone here. However, it is extremely memorable. The fight's been built up for the entire game, the Black Knight has been imposing and shows up just often enough that you can't forget about him. Maybe he even killed one of your units in Blood Runs Red. No matter what you're doing throughout the game, the Black Knight is always lurking in the background. So when you finally get to fight him, even if the mechanics of the fight aren't particularly interesting, it's an extremely tense encounter where every Ike Aether proc makes you want to pop off, while every Luna proc makes your heart sink. Strategically, this fight sucks and I would definitely do it differently. But it's such a strong moment in the narrative that on your first playthrough you can almost look past it. And this sort of applies to a lot of Tellius bosses. Not that most of them are as mechanically frustrating to me as the Black Knight fight, but Tellius bosses are often memorable more for their place in the narrative. They're frequently built up in the story, and the games are loaded with boss dialogue, often for multiple different player units. Boss dialogue can even make a player feel clever for getting it. I can't tell you how many times I've felt like, oh, I wonder if this character has boss dialogue, and when they do, it feels like a little reward from the game for paying attention to the story. I think the way Tellius bosses are remembered is a testament to how strong dialogue and dramatic buildup can go in making a boss feel good and memorable. And Fire Emblem has achieved this before, even with bosses that haven't been built up that much. Mustafa from Fire Emblem Awakening is a boss a lot of people remember fondly, but he only exists for one map. Coming after a somber moment in the story, supported by solemn map music and sporting dialogue that reminds you of the humanity of the enemy soldiers, makes Mustafa a strong character for a single chapter boss. So strong dialogue or a strong chapter narrative can really enhance a boss as well. For the last boss we're going to look at, we're going to step away from Fire Emblem for a second and towards a fan game called Embrace of the Fog. This is a roguelike with Fire Emblem-esque mechanics, and without going into all of the differences, of which there are plenty, some notable ones are limited access to 1-2 range and limited access to healing. Also, unit death being okay and sort of expected. We'll be playing multiple runs after all. At the end of each section in Embrace the Fog, there's a very cool boss with a fun mechanic that makes you play the game a little bit differently. The first boss is a dragon surrounded by 4 pillars as well as a group of enemies. Destroying the pillars makes it a lot easier to kill the dragon, and you're encouraged to move with intentionality, because reinforcements will spawn if you take too long. Since access to healing is limited, you'd really rather not have to fight those reinforcements because they will slowly whittle you down. So this boss fight is pretty cool. I didn't have too hard of a time with it in the footage here since I brought a character with an AoE, and I also added quite a few upgrades to my team after playing several runs of the game. But this boss is pretty tricky the first time and feels exciting to fight. I think this shows how you can make a boss exciting by giving them unique mechanics and designing a map around them. Obviously, not every boss on every map needs a unique mechanic, but doing things to set the most important bosses apart from each other seems like a good move to me. So overall, I think it's sort of okay for not every Fire Emblem boss to be super exciting. A lot of bosses aren't meant to be a huge deal mechanically or narratively. However, strong, well-designed bosses can add a lot to a map, particularly at dramatic points in a story. While Fire Emblem hasn't always been the best at this, there's a pretty big history of stationary bosses that you can safely take out at the end of a map. There are great bosses in FE's history as well. Given the strides that the last few games have made towards bosses that legitimately add value to a map, I have high hopes for the future of bosses in the series. I would love to see the game continue experimenting with things like multiple bosses, and it would be great if they mixed that in with more objective types too. Things like escape all, kill boss and seize, kill boss and also kill a certain amount of enemies. I think these could all add texture to maps and allow bosses to play more roles than just sitting on a throne or being the critical objective of a map. I would also love to see more unique mechanics tied to climactic bosses, whether that be things like Zephia's Override, or like Embrace of the Fog's Dragon Fight, or even like Miklon turning into a monster after you kill him in his Chapter of Three Houses. I think there's a lot of space to spice up bosses, even if the occasional forgettable boss that isn't the point of a map is just fine too. But what do you think about Fire Emblem bosses? If you have a favorite, I would love to hear about it in the comments. Otherwise, thank you for sticking around to the end of the video. If you liked it, you can leave a like or subscribe so that you don't miss the next upload, or hop in the community Discord in the video description to chat about Fire Emblem more. Either way, thank you for hanging out, and I hope you have a lovely week.